Tones in Mandarin are tricky, and students face many different types of problems. Identifying the type of problem is important for fixing it. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about learning tones and some challenges you might face when doing so. Today, I'm not so interested in talking about specific errors, such as mispronouncing the third tone, but instead I want to talk about different kinds of problems. So, for example, not hearing tones is a different problem from not being able to pronounce them yourself. And as we shall see, there are many other types of tone problems that you might encounter when learning Chinese as an adult. Before diving into the 7 different kinds of tone problems, let's talk a little bit about the importance of tones. This is something I have covered many times on the podcast before, but learning tones in Chinese really is important and it's not optional. The best way to think about it as a non-native speaker is to compare with vowels in English. So, for example, for Chinese learners studying English, it's common to not be able to hear the difference or pronounce the difference between words like bit and beat. If you're a native speaker of English, you will think that the difference between these words is obvious. It's not even something you think about. But when you see the tones in Mandarin, they feel completely arbitrary sometimes. And this is the same as it feels for the Chinese students trying to learn English and hear the difference between bit and beat. They also think it's completely arbitrary and many cannot hear the difference. Now, this doesn't mean that your Mandarin will be completely incomprehensible just because you miss a single tone. Usually, it can be figured out by context what you meant, and so making a single mistake is usually not a problem. This is similar to how it works in English as well, because if you listen to a Chinese person speaking English and they mix up beat and bit, you will probably still understand what they say in most cases. However, it would be ludicrous to say that vowels are not important in English just because making a mistake doesn't influence communication in most cases. And this is the way it is with tones as well. If you want to be able to communicate clearly in Chinese, tones are clearly not optional. This is not the time and place to go through the basics of tones in Mandarin, but fortunately we have 3 podcast episodes that already cover this, and they are all collected in one article called The Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, and I'll make sure to put links in the show notes. So let's move on to the 7 kinds of tone problems and what you should do about them. Here is an overview, and then we will talk about each type of problem individually. So number 1 is not hearing the tones. Number 2, not being able to produce basic tones. Number 3, not being able to produce tones in context. Number 4, not knowing or remembering the correct tone. Number 5, not being aware of phonological rules. Number 6, mixing up tones and intonation. And finally, number 7, falling back on old habits in demanding situations. So let's go through these briefly and see what the problem is and what you can do about it. So first up is not hearing the tones, and this can manifest itself in several different ways. Maybe when the teacher says that there are 4 tones in Mandarin, we have ma, 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 and ma. You simply feel they sound the same, or maybe you feel that they sound a little bit different, but you can't identify that difference and so can't rely on it to tell which word is which. Or maybe you can hear the difference when your teacher is saying it like that or in a structured exercise, but not when you listen to normal people speaking Mandarin. These are phases that almost all learners go through, and there's nothing wrong with thinking that tones are difficult to hear. This is something I've researched extensively, and it is also part of that guide to Mandarin tones that I mentioned earlier, so there is a separate podcast episode and even a separate article focusing on only this issue. To put it briefly, you will learn to hear tones by hearing them used in different contexts over time, and this is something that isn't easy, but that most learners will be able to do eventually. If you want to speed up your learning, there are essentially 2 things you can do. One is called high variability training, and that is essentially when you listen to tones presented to you systematically by different speakers, so you learn to figure out what part of each tone is the crucial one or what's used to identify which tone is which. Or you can rely on a native speaker to exaggerate the difference between the tones and then gradually decrease this exaggeration until pronunciation is more natural. Like I said though, I discussed these methods in more detail in that article, so do check the show notes. Moving on to number 2, not being able to produce basic tones. Obviously, hearing the tones is not enough, you also need to pronounce them yourself. I should mention though that listening here is the key when it comes to good pronunciation in general, so if you haven't made sure that you can actually hear the tones, spending a lot of time on pronouncing them might be misguided. The best way to learn to pronounce tones, though, also includes listening, and it is mimicking native speakers. This is great because you listen attentively to what a native speaker says, and then you try to repeat that yourself. So you get both the attentive listening and the speaking at the same time, and you can often also spot errors by comparing what you said with what the native speaker said. This is perhaps a good opportunity to shamelessly promote my pronunciation course, which does of course contain everything you need to know about learning tones, including everything I talk about in this article. The reason I mention it here though is because that in lesson 5 in section 1 of the course, I have a video which is specifically about mimicking native speakers, where I talk about why this is so good and also show you how to do it using a free program like Audacity. This lesson is available in its entirety for free on YouTube, so go check it out if you want to, and as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. The other thing I strongly suggest you get early on is corrective feedback. So don't study pronunciation for too long without verifying with someone that you're doing it right. If you can't hear the tones, it could be that you're pronouncing them incorrectly, even though you think they are correct. While it can be a great idea to hire someone to do this, and that's something I recommend that you do if you have the means to do so, there are also free methods, such as playing some kind of tone bingo. And this is essentially where you let a native speaker guess what you're saying without them having a clue about what you're trying to say. And I've described this also in a separate podcast episode and article, and again, links in the show notes. The problem here is that you can't just ask someone if your Chinese or your tones are good, because they are invariably going to tell you that your tones are great, even though they're not. And this is not to deceive you, it's just to encourage you to learn the language. And it's well meant, in other words, but not terribly helpful. But when playing tone bingo, they don't know what you're trying to say, and so you will know if your tones are good or not. Next up, we have number 3, not being able to produce tones in context, so inside of words. Chinese people don't go around speaking only in single-syllable words. That is indeed quite rare, and most words in Chinese actually have 2 syllables, and there are of course words that have more than 2 syllables as well, but most have 2. As most of you have probably experienced already, it's one thing to be able to say the tones in isolation one at a time, and another to be able to do so inside of words, even short words with just 2 syllables. There are several things going on here. For example, the cognitive load is higher because you need to keep track of more things at the same time, and sometimes you also need to change the tones depending on context, although that I've identified as a separate problem we're going to talk about later. For the basic issue of being able to pronounce words correctly, not just single characters, the solution is to focus on tone pairs. So essentially, there are only 20 combinations of tones in Mandarin, if we include the neutral tone, and if you learn one word for each pair very thoroughly, so you're 100% sure that it's right, you can then use that tone combination, that pattern, to pronounce any word you will encounter. This is again something I've covered in detail in the course, and this time I don't have a completely free video on YouTube, but I do have part of that lesson published on YouTube as well, and there I mention why this is so powerful, and I also show you some examples. So again, check out the link in the show notes. Moving on to number 4, not knowing or remembering the correct tone. This is a tricky problem as a teacher, because if you as a student say something in Mandarin and your tones are off, I can never really know if it's because you didn't know the tones in the first place, maybe you think it's a second tone but it's actually a third tone, or you do know that it's a third tone but you just pronounced it incorrectly. These problems look identical on the surface, but the remedy is completely different, and this I think is a good opportunity to highlight why it's so important to know what the problem is. If you can't remember the right tone, that is clearly not the same thing as not being able to say it even though you do remember it. The first one is an issue of memory, maybe of vocabulary acquisition, and the second one is more an issue of pronunciation. You can't pronounce this specific tone combination, for example. This is actually something we covered in a recent episode number 243, where I talked about how you can use mnemonics to remember tones. So if you're struggling with this, you can check out that episode. Anyway, what I'm saying here is that identifying what tone problem you actually have out of these 7 that I'm talking about here is important, because the remedy, how you want to practice to fix the problem, is completely different. This brings us to number 5, not being aware of phonological rules. So, phonology is the study of how sounds are organized in a language, including how they interact with each other. As mentioned earlier, some tones are not pronounced the same in isolation as they are in context, and then to be able to pronounce them correctly, you need to learn how context influences pronunciation. The most basic example of this that I think all of you will have heard about is ni hao, which has two third tones, but if you listen to when I say it, ni hao, these tones are clearly different. The first one is a rising tone, and the second one is either just a low tone or maybe a dipping tone. But the first one cannot be a low tone and cannot be a dipping tone. That's just wrong. So you need to learn that when you have two consecutive third tones, the first one turns into a rising tone. This is a compulsory rule you have to apply, and like I said, if you don't do it, you're wrong. But there are also other types of phonological rules, and most of these are not written in your textbook, and most people are not even aware that they are doing it. But just to bring up one example, when you have a second tone squeezed between first and second tones, it usually comes out as a first tone as well. So an example of this is if you want to say third grade in Chinese, that would be 3年级. So that's first tone, second tone, second tone. 3年级. But what many people say here is actually 3年级 with a first tone on the middle syllable. Another example is my Chinese name, which is Ling Yun Long with 3 second tones. And most people don't say Ling Yun Long with 3 second tones like that, but rather a first tone in the middle, so Ling Yun Long. And I should mention here that some speed is necessary for this to happen, so if you ask someone to enunciate, they will say 3年级 and Ling Yun Long, but if you listen to what people say in real life when speaking quickly and not being monitored, they usually change the middle tone here into a flat tone. If you found this confusing, just ignore it, it's not compulsory as I said, but you do have to learn how the third tone is pronounced, and I have a separate article and podcast episode about that. You also need to learn how the words bu and i are pronounced, so no and one, and that is also covered in an article and podcast episode called Obligatory and Optional Tone Change Rules in Mandarin. Moving on to number 6, mixing up tones and intonation. If you listen to the Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, as I suggested earlier, you will know that tones and intonation are not the same thing, even though they are both about pitch height. To put it briefly, all spoken languages have intonation, but not all languages have tones, and so English doesn't have tones, but Mandarin does. Thus, a common problem for students is that they let the intonation pattern overwrite the tones. And so to show you an example here, when we have a second tone at the end of a sentence in Chinese, we need to go up, even if it is a statement. And in English, we're used to going down at the end of statements. But if it's a second tone, you can't do that, because if you go down, it turns into a fourth tone. The reverse case can also occur when students ask the teacher if their pronunciation is accurate. So let's say we're dealing with single-syllable words, and some students will then go up on every single one, as if they're asking the teacher, is this correct? And you can imagine a student studying English tentatively giving an answer to a question and saying something like tree, car, table. And the teacher, of course, can still say that the pronunciation of these words is correct, because it is. But if you do this in Mandarin, you will be wrong, except if it happens to be a second tone, of course. I won't go into exactly how intonation works in Mandarin, because, as I said, Mandarin has intonation too, it's just that it's superimposed on the tones. So for example, if you go up on a question, which you do in Mandarin, you raise the whole pitch contour. So for example, a falling tone might start higher and end higher than a normal fourth tone, but it still falls, and then the whole pattern then will go upwards. Okay, so assuming now that you've been able to overcome all these challenges, you're still not home, because we have problem number 7, falling back on old habits in demanding situations. This is rather straightforward. Being able to do something when you focus on it is not the same thing as being able to do it when you have a bunch of other things to focus on at the same time. To illustrate this, we can look at when I learned the third tone, which I learned incorrectly, and only after about 2 years I realized that I'm doing this wrong and I had to change and go back and learn it from scratch. While I didn't encounter all the types of problems we talked about so far, I did encounter many of them. For example, at first I didn't hear the difference between what I said and what the correct version was, even though I knew what it was. I could describe it in theory, I just didn't hear it. Since this is about the third tone, the problem wasn't that I couldn't produce it in isolation, but rather that I had misunderstood how it was pronounced in context, so either not being able to pronounce it in words or not being aware of the phonological rules. Once I had sorted that out though, which took a lot of time and effort, I wasn't home and dry, because I still had to be able to do this when focusing on something else, such as when delivering an oral presentation or just talking with someone, when the focus necessarily isn't on tones. This took much longer to fix, and I remember when we prepared for pronunciation exams in grad school, we were becoming teachers after all, so you need decent pronunciation. This was an issue I was mindful of, and I still made mistakes occasionally. And so this is what the seventh and final tone problem is about, being able to say things correctly even when you're focusing on other things. And this is maybe harder if you've gone back and changed or fixed an error, as I did, compared to if you did it correctly in the first place. But what I'm trying to say here is that just because you've gone through steps 1 through 6, it doesn't mean that you're done. You still need to be able to do it under pressure. Okay, so those were 7 kinds of tone problems you might encounter as a learner of Mandarin. And my goal here was not to convince you that learning to pronounce Mandarin is impossible, but rather to show that there are many different kinds of problems and which type of problem you encounter matters for how you deal with it. And since many of these problems sound the same, you need to figure out which one you have encountered so that you know how to deal with it. For much more guidance when it comes to Chinese tones and pronunciation in general, do check out my pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.